Well, good afternoon, and welcome to episode 8 of Beyond John Ethics and Community in Early Christianity. We are now 8 weeks into this 12-week series, making progress. Let's begin. I want to begin by kind of recapping some of the things that we discussed last time. We talked about persecution in the early church, and we covered basically 3-ish phases of persecution. We talked about Nero in the first century, the Great Fire of Rome. We talked about how Nero apparently, according to Tacitus, used the Christians as a convenient scapegoat to pin blame for the Great Fire of Rome on at least what was to Nero an insignificant group that could be easily utilized to sort of take some of the heat for the Great Fire, pun intended, off of Nero himself. We also talked about Domitian later in the first century. We talked about how Domitian was sort of a religious traditionalist. He was a sort of traditional Roman. And he was attempting to sort of restore some of Rome's prosperity by sort of reinvigorating the Pax Deorum, Rome's duty to the gods. His thinking was that by sort of revitalizing traditional Roman religion, traditional Roman values and piety, that this would sort of bolster Rome's standing in the eyes of the gods. And so he persecuted not only Christians, but Jews as well. This is a time period that may be referenced in First Clements. First Clement opens by talking about this period of recent unrest and trouble that has come upon the church in Rome. But after Domitian, Christians are basically left alone by the state. So in both of these kind of first two phases of persecution, the persecution is relatively short-lived. It is somewhat reactionary. We also talked about Trajan's instructions to Pliny, a Roman governor. Pliny was instructed not to seek out Christians to put on trial, but if Christians are accused and they refuse to worship the gods, basically committing contempt of court, as we discussed last time, punish them. If they agree to recant and change, then pardon them. And so what we discovered is that the Roman officials were actually quite keen on getting Christians to recant or to agree to worship the Roman gods, to comply. So Christians were more likely to face non-judicial forms of persecution. That is, sort of being perhaps harassed and hated by their neighbors, and perhaps less so in a legal setting and more in a sort of day-to-day manner. We also looked at the Acts of the Silitan Martyrs. This is basically the story of a trial of several Christians towards the end of the 2nd century. This seems to be based on a court document of some kind that was sort of repurposed as a Christian martyr story. And we saw how over and over the official who is conducting the trial of these Christians tries to get them to recant again and again. But Christians were sort of known for being obstinate, and so they sort of refuse to comply. They're very much not cooperative with the trial process. And so their obstinacy persists, and they are executed. We also talked about this sort of last phase of persecution by the Roman Emperor Decius. This is, I think, the sort of thing that most people envision when they talk about Christian persecution, that is something that is state-driven. Decius mandated that all citizens of the Roman Empire procure a certificate of compliance. And to get the certificate, they had to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods. And so if Christians refused, this would get them in serious trouble. And so this is perhaps where Roman persecution sort of veers into the state-driven type of persecution. I sort of keep using the example of Nazi Germany, but that is sort of the image that many folks have when it comes to persecution in the Roman Empire, and it's really not until we get to Decius here in the middle of the 3rd century that we see something that could be likened to that sort of state-driven type of persecution. And Decius was only in power for a few years, and so this persecution did not outlast him. And so we came to a few conclusions. Perhaps the most important is that persecution was sporadic and local. It was not, as I said, state-driven or inquisitorial. And so the most common type of persecution would have been sort of low-level, everyday sort of conflict with Roman neighbors. Having said that, Christian beliefs and practices were still very much countercultural for their social context. And so this would have made Christians seem rather strange to their Roman neighbors, and it would have made them seem at least somewhat antisocial, given the very political and civic nature of Roman religion. And so, although martyrdom was not imminent, if you look at all the Christian texts on martyrdom that we've looked at so far, you're left with the impression that martyrdom was something that could happen at any moment to Christians. And this isn't quite the case. Martyrdom isn't necessarily something that was absolutely going to happen to Christians at the time, but this is how they are thinking about it, framing the notion of martyrdom theologically, that all Christians should be prepared to face martyrdom if necessary. And so that sort of framing is, I think, an important part of how Christians are thinking about themselves as members of this society that is at times hostile to them. Today, we're going to shift to something a little bit different. We're going to look at parts of a text called the Didache. The word Didache is just a Greek word that means teaching. The full name of this document is The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. Accounts vary as to how old this document is. I think I most often see dating around the 1st century. And this is kind of what seems reasonable to me, but there's varying opinions as to when this document was written and compiled. But one of the interesting things about it is that this text had its first modern publishing in 1883. And so once again, as with the Epistle to Ignatius, for example, some of these texts, although they are quite old, are sort of newcomers in terms of when they sort of entered sort of the modern academic world. And so we have only had this text for a little over 200 years. Sorry, not 200 years. 1883. So we just haven't had this text for very long. If you think about sort of the grand scope of church history, this text has sort of only very recently been rediscovered and studied. And one of the other interesting things about this is that there are a few questions as to the relationship between Didache and the Gospel of Matthew. There's some varying ideas about how these two texts relate to each other. One opinion is that Matthew might actually be literarily dependent on Didache. That is, Didache would have been a text that the author of Matthew was familiar with and perhaps even used when compiling the gospel text. There's also some opinions to the contrary that Didache is actually dependent on Matthew. Either way, there seems to be some sort of connection there, which I think is really interesting. There are also significant parallels to the Epistle of James. As we'll see in a second, there's this notion of what's commonly referred to as the two ways tradition. And this is sort of a way of thinking about ethics where you have the way of life and the way of death. One example of this in the Old Testament would be something like Psalm 1, where you have the way of the righteous, the way of the wise person who follows God, and then the way of the wicked, which leads to destruction. And so Didache kind of participates in this idea, uses this notion of the two ways, the way of life and the way of death. You see stuff like this in James as well. So this is a kind of more or less traditional Jewish ethical paradigm, the way of life and the way of death. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But, sort of two big ideas here. There's some connection between this document, Didache, and the Gospel of Matthew. Whether you think that Matthew knew about and used Didache as a source or, the other way around, there is a connection there, seemingly. And then there's also this very sort of Jewish ethical paradigm that is now being used in the context of a Christian document. So some relation to Matthew and a clear Jewish Christian way of thinking about and talking about how one lives one's life. Okay, you probably saw this coming. The title of this episode, This is the Way, of course, a nod to The Mandalorian, which is a TV show based on the Star Wars universe. And you also may be aware that the term the way is used in the book of Acts to describe Christianity. It was a term, a name for the Christian faith. And so I think this is actually helpful. So as soon as I sort of noticed that the saying, this is the way, which is, it's something that characters in The Mandalorian say. So the Mandalorians are this sort of exiled group of people, and they adhere to this ethical code that they refer to as the way. And so the phrase, this is the way, kind of becomes this greeting or passphrase of sorts among them, and they are known for adhering to this strict sort of almost Spartan-like ethical code. And so the characters will commonly say, oh, this is the way, this is what we must do, things like that. And I knew as soon as I noticed that the characters were talking in this way that there was going to be some opportunity for early Christianity memeing, given the use of that phrase in Acts, and then also the notion of the way of life, the way of death here in Didache. But I think there's actually something a bit more substantive there than a simple similarity with the term the way. In the context of the Mandalorians are sort of this exiled group. They hail from is it a planet, Mandalore? But they are sort of part of this older tradition, but they're now scattered throughout the universe, and they sort of live in these enclaves and operate somewhat secretively to protect themselves, and they are the followers of this way. So they're kind of trying to adhere to old tradition in a context that is very different from sort of the traditional ways of their people. There is a parallel here, I think, for the early church. The early Christians, and I think we see this in Didache, are attempting to live in a way that is prescribed by the Old Testament, Jewish ethics, and yet their community is undergoing change, incorporating Gentiles. They're having to operate in, a very Gentile-dominated context, which, wouldn't be all that strange for the Jewish diaspora. But nonetheless, they are trying to move forward, the early church, in a way that remains faithful to sort of the traditional teaching of the Old Testament. So we see some of this here in Didache. Okay, yeah, here's a meme. This is the way. So, well, let's actually talk about some real stuff. So I want to point you to sort of the beginning of the text here. Didache starts out with this description of the way of life and the way of death. So there are two ways. One leads to life, one leads to death. And so what we have here is what I think you can describe as a repackaging of Jewish ethical tradition for a now sort of increasingly diverse Christian context in which you do have Gentiles as well as Jews. And so Didache begins in this way. There are two ways, one of life and one of death. Therefore, the way of life is this. First, to love the God who made you. Second, your neighbor as yourself. This sounds very familiar, right? The two great commandments. Didache continues. That should be teaching. Now the teaching of these words is this: bless those who curse you, and pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what is the benefit if we love those who love us? Do not even the Gentiles do this? So if you're familiar with just sort of the ethical teaching of Jesus in the Gospels, if you're familiar with, for example, the teaching of James in his epistle in the New Testament, this sounds very familiar. What's interesting is that this material comes first. So this material is drawn from traditions about Jesus. Again, the relationship between Didache and Matthew makes it difficult to really discern whether Didache is drawing on Matthew or it maybe is utilizing similar stories about Jesus that the compiler is aware of. But regardless, this material does pretty much parallel Matthew 5 through 7. So again, if you're familiar with how Jesus talks about ethics in the Gospels, this material will sound very familiar to you. What's interesting is that this is then followed by what is referred to as the second commandment of the teaching. And so this section here is followed by kind of things that are in the same vein, how you treat your enemies, things of that nature. And then this is followed by more specific instruction that addresses some issues that Christians would run into in sort of Gentile-dominated contexts, such as the practice of magic, the issue of abortion, issues of sexual ethics. So, for example, in Didache chapter 2, do not commit sexual immorality, do not steal, do not practice magic, do not use potions, do not murder a child by abortion, do not kill the just-born one, do not yearn after the things of your neighbor. These are sort of, I would say, in terms of ethical instruction, sort of more straightforward, sort of expoundings upon, already established kind of ethical tradition. But it's interesting to me that the material that directly parallels Jesus' teaching comes first, and it's followed by kind of more standard sort of legal teaching. I think some folks would argue that there is perhaps a priority there. Maybe are the words of Jesus being prioritized over sort of normal ethical teaching? Possibly. It's hard to say. Does that phrase, the second commandment there, mean that this other teaching is being given sort of a subservient status? Again, hard to say. But it is interesting, the very specific prohibitions against magic. Didache goes on to say, "My child, do not be a soothsayer, because it leads to idolatry. Neither an enchanter, nor an astrologer, nor a magician, nor desire to see the same, for from all these idolatry is born." Kind of interesting. And magic, sort of superstition, would be something that you might run into. For example, one Roman practice that I'm aware of is the use of what were known as curse tablets, where you would write a curse against someone on a tablet and throw it into a fountain or something similar. There were these sort of magical practices in the ancient world that Christians might be persuaded to participate in. But very clearly here, these are sort of traditional Jewish instructions against these sorts of practices. So, I forgot to mention one thing. The reference to "my child" kind of suggests that some of this instructional material is oriented towards laying out sort of a basic ethical pattern for individuals who are perhaps new to the Christian community. And so addressing the reader as "my child" perhaps kind of brings to mind someone who is a catechumen, undergoing the process of catechesis, entering the Christian community, being taught the basics of the faith. And so here, the basics of the faith consists largely of this sort of ethical instruction. Also worth noting, the teaching here, and keep in mind that the title of this document is "The Teaching of the 12 Apostles." And so there's some idea that, what is being presented here has been passed down from the apostles to the church. And so the teaching that is presented in this document is presented as a standard that should be followed and adhered to. So, for example, chapter 6, Didache says, "See to it that no one leads you astray from this way of the teaching, since he teaches you apart from God." So in a similar way to, for example, Paul saying, "Hey, if anyone comes to you with another gospel that's not the same as what I and other leaders have been telling you, reject that teaching." In a similar way, if anyone is presenting you with teaching that is different than what is in this document, stay away from that person, because they are teaching you apart from God. Speaking of Paul, one interestingly specific warning that Didache gives here in chapter 6 is food sacrificed to idols. If you're familiar with Paul's epistles, there's this whole discussion about food sacrificed to idols. That is food that was basically cooked as a part of a sacrifice to an idol, to a Greek or Roman god. And Paul's basic answer to this question as to whether or not it was okay for Christians to consume this food, even if they weren't actively participating in the worship of this god, he basically kind of concludes that, yeah, it's fine. Like, it's not really a big deal. Don't sweat it. Didache takes a decidedly different approach, noting that food sacrificed to idols is the worship of dead gods. So sort of explicitly warning Christians against consuming this food. Kind of interesting. So there is kind of a conflict there. But this kind of makes sense. In a Jewish context, I don't expect that it would be okay to eat food sacrificed to idols. And so, given that Didache seems to be coming from a very Jewish perspective, ethically speaking, that might make sense. But, there is a difference here. Paul in his epistles largely sort of eschews strict Torah following, but much of the ethical teaching in Didache is basically Torah derived. So this is kind of a Christianized version of law following, but it's presented as a positive way to follow Jesus. And so there's just a difference here. I do not sort of have enough knowledge about Didache and other relevant documents to sort of go into that too much further. But I do think it's interesting that a document like Didache in the first century is sort of handling the issue of Christian adoption of Jewish ethics in a different way than Paul or some of the other New Testament authors. Kind of interesting. So this brings us to the main thing that I wanted to talk about today. And we are not going to cover a lot of, I think, really interesting things from Didache because I want to devote an entire session to talking about sacraments in the early church. So baptism, the Lord's Supper, and other practices like that. And this is, I think, some of the more interesting material in Didache has to do with baptism and the Lord's Supper. But again, I want to sort of devote more time to covering not only the sacramental material in Didache, but in other texts from the early church as well. So we're going to kind of save that for later. But one of the things that has come up consistently is the notion of church government. How is the early church structuring their leadership? How are they thinking about leadership? This came up in First Clement, the very first text that we looked at. The occasion for writing is the Corinthian church's deposition of several of their presbyters, their elders. And so the church in Rome wrote to them specifically to address that issue. Again, in the letters of Ignatius. I have here on the screen right now one of the slides from our discussion of Ignatius's letters. So just to kind of refresh our memory, Ignatius consistently emphasizes the importance of being united under the bishop, united under the other officers of the church. Ignatius seems to assume as normal a system wherein you have one bishop, sort of a regional overseer, multiple elders or presbyters, and also multiple deacons. And this structure is, for Ignatius, kind of the central pillar of church unity. We noted his use of the metaphor of the lyre. He said, "Run together in harmony with the mind of the bishop, for your council of elders is attuned with the bishop as strings to the lyre. Now you must join the chorus so that being in harmonious unanimity, taking your pitch from God, you may sing in unity." So the lyre of the church leaders is sort of attuned to God's pitch, as it were. And so that brings about this harmonious chorus in the church. And we noted that this seems to be kind of a big deal for Ignatius. He's very keen to say, hey, this is the way to have an orderly church. This is the way to continue on with this system of church government. And we noted that there seems to have been a transition from a more charismatic form of church government by which I mean something that is charisma-driven, that is gift-driven. You see this in Paul's letters to the Corinthians, for example. There, the roles of different leaders in the church are primarily driven by the giftings that they have. One has the gift of prophecy. One has the gift of teaching. One has the gift of hospitality, etc. And so one's role in the church and how one uses their particular gifting to serve the church is kind of driven by whatever it is that they have, gifting-wise. This is a little bit different than the very office-driven system that we see cropping up in the letters of Ignatius, in 1 Clement, where you have presbyters and deacons. And so things are very much driven by the office that is held by individuals. And so this is somewhat reflected here. We are actually going to see something that is more similar to what Paul describes here in Didache. This kind of makes sense. If this is a first century text, then that kind of might line up a little bit. So Didache seems to reflect this earlier stage in the early church's ecclesiological development. And so here's what we see in Didache. Very little time is spent on the notion of presbyters and deacons. We'll get to that in a little bit. But what Didache does spend a fair amount of time on is this notion that communities are being visited by traveling teachers, itinerant teachers. So they're traveling around to various communities, and they are, when they arrive in a particular Christian community, sort of invoking some sort of right to hospitality. So they're traveling, and they say, hey, I'm here, I'm a traveling teacher, and so you should show me hospitality and provide for my needs. So, Didache says in chapter 11, therefore, whoever comes and teaches you, that should be, all these things which were mentioned before, welcome him. So again, this notion that the material presented in Didache is a standard. Deviation from the standard is bad. Adherence to the standard is good. So if that teacher comes to you and teaches you consistently with what is outlined in this document, welcome him. Hooray. But if the one teaching is himself turning away so that he may teach a different doctrine leading to destruction, do not listen to him. Okay, so if the teaching differs from what Didache has presented, if the apostolic tradition is not what is being taught, that's bad. Don't listen to that person. But things get even more specific. So, okay, if the teacher doesn't teach what is being taught in Didache, don't listen to them. That kind of makes sense. But things get very specific. If a teacher stays 3 days, he is a false prophet. And if an apostle asks for money, he is a false prophet. I want to say a word real quick about some of the terminology that's used here. Didache uses terms like apostle, prophet, both of which are used in the writings of Paul, for example. This terminology can sound a little strange to us, especially if we think of the notion of a prophet primarily as somebody who has the gift of divinely empowered foresight or prediction. Even in the Old Testament prophets, being a prophet is not all about predicting the future. It's more about teaching the word of God. And so I think when the word prophet here is used, it's not so much capital P, Old Testament style prophet. It's more someone who is preaching about Jesus or something like that. So a traveling preacher. There are references to a prophet speaking in the Spirit. It's kind of difficult to know exactly what that is referring to, but I don't know that it's necessary to kind of bring in some of the complications that the cessationism versus continuationism discussion might bring about. Likewise, an apostle seems to refer mostly to not a sort of capital A apostle, i.e. one of the 12, but rather more like a missionary, someone who has been sent, apostle, meaning one who is sent. But the point here is that it's okay if a traveling teacher stays for one day, maybe two if it's absolutely necessary. But if a teacher overstays their welcome and imposes upon the hospitality of the community such that it becomes an abuse of that privilege, then that actually invalidates their teaching. Likewise, if an apostle asks for money, they're a false prophet. And so what we see is that not only does teaching contrary to the apostolic tradition act as the sign of a false prophet, but any abuse of the hospitality of the community, any departure from what seems to be an expectation of itineracy, invalidates that teacher's message. Also, reference is made to folks who are traveling. So if there's a traveler and they decide that they want to stay with your community, they should work. So you might have a traveling Christian who decides, I'm going to stay with this Christian community. If they're going to stay for any period of time, they should actually work to provide for themselves and not be what Didache refers to as a Christmonger. That is somebody who uses the name of Christ for material gain. So, furthermore, on the sort of flip side of things, if a prophet or a teacher is true, then they do deserve to be provided for. They are worthy of their food. And a reference is also made to the community sort of first fruits being collected to provide for the local teacher or prophet. This part, I don't know quite why, but this part of Didache has always just stuck out to me. It's so kind of foreign, I think. It's foreign, but also not. Like, I first read Didache during seminary, and for whatever reason, just a lot of the things described in Didache are just very different to how modern Christians think about stuff. But especially, I would say, in the United States, we have a problem with people profiting off of the name of Christ. We have an infestation of Christmongers, right? And sometimes I hear about mega church pastors sort of with millions in severance pay or whatever, or leaders of large Christian organizations just having ridiculous salaries. And it just brings me back to Didache here. The early church would not have put up with that. They would have labeled these folks as Christmongers and identified them as false teachers. And this is not at all saying that the worker does not deserve their wages. If a teacher is true and wants to reside among you, they are worthy of the food that you provide. In my own denomination, the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, When a pastor is called to serve a congregation, the congregation agrees to provide materially for that pastor to remove the burden of, I believe the phrase, the cares of the world is what is used, to remove that concern so that that individual can focus on the work of ministry. And that's all well and good. But here, Didache comes out very strongly against profiting on the name of Christ. And rightfully so, I think. Let's see, anything else about that? Okay. So what about sort of the offices of the church that we're familiar with? What about some of these offices that are mentioned in other early Christian literature, mentioned kind of in language that we are more familiar with? In chapter 15, Didache says, "Therefore appoint for yourselves overseers and deacons worthy of the Lord, men who are gentle and not lovers of money," important, "and truthful and well proven, for to you they themselves also minister the ministry of the prophets and teachers. Therefore, you must not disregard them, for they are your honorable ones, along with the prophets and teachers." So, the prophets and teachers, sort of the traveling teachers, they are not the only ones who do this sort of work. They are not the only ones in the church who fulfill this role. But rather, the overseers and deacons, they do this ministry as well. And so these should be appointed. And just a note here, I think I've probably mentioned this a couple times when the subject of deacons comes up, but it's worth noting that the office of deacons has always been one that is connected with spiritual things. Again, sometimes we think of, at least in the Presbyterian context, of the elders are kind of the spiritual leaders and the deacons sort of manage the physical needs of the church. But as we see in the book of Acts, as we see in the testimony of the early church, both elders and deacons participate in the spiritual leadership of the church in some way. Are there differences? Certainly. But all that to say, deacons, there's a spiritual element to their work as well. Even if they sort of possess a different type of authority, it is still a spiritual office. So there's an interesting difference here. There is a difference between where order in the church is located in sort of Ignatius and Clement and some of the other texts that we've looked at, and in Didache. And so Ignatius and Clement, they largely locate the source of the church's order in the structure, that is in this system of offices, of overseers and elders and deacons. For example, the entire sort of situation that First Clement was written to address was the unjustified removal of duly ordained presbyters by the church at Corinth. So they removed these presbyters without cause. Likewise, Ignatius, over and over, says, "Unite under the bishop, honor the elders, do not meet and gather without them. It is the presence and supervision of the elders and the bishop that gives Christian worship its legitimacy." However, in Didache, it's a little different. Order is, at least in terms of what Didache actually describes, order seems to be more located in the community's adherence to the way. That is, it is the community that is instructed to guard against fraudulent doctrine to reject false teachers, to guard against abuse of hospitality. And so, they're instructed to be suspicious of leaders that sort of operate outside of the guidelines, that do abuse hospitality, that do use the name of Christ for personal gain. So, it may be the case that for Ignatius and Clement, the bishop is the one who sort of is applying the apostolic tradition. So there may not be all that much difference here, but I think it is interesting that Ignatius and Clement have largely a positive view of church leaders, whereas there's a little bit more suspicion in Didache, at least for these situations of abusive hospitality and things of that nature. But as we know, this looser, more charismatic, gifting-driven structure where you do have these traveling teachers, and there isn't so much of a localized, orderly structure, that does eventually give way to this more institutionalized ecclesiology. And that seems to be, as we talked about with Ignatius, kind of, he's very keen to, as he is going to his death, writing these letters, he does seem very keen to impart the importance of that structure. But I just think that the difference is fascinating. That is actually where we're going to leave off in Didache. It's very practical. There isn't a lot in the way of like arguments. In some of these other documents, there's like more of a rhetorical structure, more of an argument that's being laid out, evidence that's being provided, things of that nature. Didache is very instructional. So that makes it kind of a unique text when compared with some of the other things that we've been looking at. We are going to return to Didache next week, along with some other texts, to think about sacraments in the early church. Didache has some interesting things to say in terms of how the sacraments were practiced. One thing I think is always sort of interesting is, every now and then you'll hear folks kind of get fed up with, modern denominationalism. Like, if we could just do away with all of this, all these denominations and sort of jettison the centuries of doctrinal complexity and theological buildup, and if we could just get back to the early church and the New Testament church, and if we could just do things the way they did, then that is somehow the key to purity in our faith and our practice. And anytime I hear somebody kind of talking that way, I just want to say, all right, read Didache. It's an early example of what first century Christianity actually looked like in terms of some of these very practical matters. And a lot of what it describes isn't all that familiar to us, So it's always, I think, a fascinating text to think about, to kind of compare our own modern day practices with some of the things that it describes. So interesting stuff. So next week we're going to look at the early Christian practices surrounding baptism, surrounding Eucharist, prayer and fasting, things of that nature. So we'll be getting into that next week. Also, again, if you're interested, Didache is not a very long text. So if you're wanting to read it, just look it up online. It is available. The Christian Classics Ethereal Library has it. So I will be doing another question and answer session on Wednesday. I didn't do one this past week. I didn't have any questions get submitted, and I got busy with some other stuff and just didn't end up working out. But that's okay. But I will be doing another Q&A session on Wednesday. So send me some questions. We'll do that. And then we will be revisiting Didache next week talking about sacraments. So, having said that, peace be with you all.